In the small town of Blackwood, there was an old cemetery at the edge of the forest, one that locals avoided after dark. Stories about it had been passed down for generations, with each person offering their own version of the haunting. But I didn't believe in ghosts back then. It all started when I moved to Blackwood for work. My job had me visiting different small towns, and Blackwood was quiet, with only a few hundred people living there. One evening, after hearing about the cemetery from a few of the older residents, I decided to take a walk and see it for myself. I didn't believe in the stories. They seemed far-fetched, like something out of a horror movie. The cemetery was located on a hill, surrounded by a thick line of trees. The gravestones were old, some of them dating back to the early 1800s, and they were weathered by time, with the names barely legible. I walked through the rows, trying to appreciate the peacefulness, but something about the place felt off. As I stood near an old gravestone, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps behind me. I froze. I was alone. I spun around, but no one was there. I figured it was just my imagination. I continued walking, telling myself to ignore it. But then the air grew colder, despite the warm evening. It was as if the temperature dropped by 10 degrees in an instant. I shivered, then heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, this time directly behind me. I turned around quickly. There was nothing, no one. I started walking faster, trying to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. But then something truly bizarre happened. As I passed one of the gravestones, a soft voice whispered my name. Ethan. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. I was certain I had heard it, clear as day. I looked around, but again there was no one. The cemetery was still, silent, and empty. Panic set in. I had to get out. I began walking briskly, but the whispers came again, louder this time, followed by the faint sound of footsteps that seemed to follow me as I walked. I could feel something behind me, like a presence, but whenever I turned, no one was there. As I reached the cemetery gate, the whispers suddenly stopped. I didn't dare look back. The next day I spoke to an elderly woman who had lived in Blackwood her whole life. I casually mentioned the cemetery and how odd I had felt there. She went pale and asked if I had heard the whispers. When I told her I had, she became serious. She said the cemetery was haunted by the ghost of a man named John Williams, who had been buried there over a century ago. According to the woman, John Williams was a well-known figure in Blackwood, but his death had been mysterious. He was found dead in the woods just beyond the cemetery, and although an inquest was held, no one knew how he died. Some said it was murder, others said it was an accident. But ever since then, strange things had happened in the cemetery. The whispers were a warning, she said. They were believed to be John's way of communicating with the living, trying to tell people what really happened to him. Curious, but also scared, I researched the town's history. I found that in 1887, John Williams had been found near the cemetery, his body bruised and broken. Despite several investigations, no one was ever able to figure out who or what had caused his death. The case was eventually closed, and his gravestone remained in the cemetery. That night I couldn't help myself. I went back to the cemetery, but this time I was not alone. A local historian who had heard about my experience agreed to accompany me. We set up flashlights and cameras, trying to capture anything unusual. We walked through the gravestones, the moonlight casting long shadows over the worn stones. And as the minutes passed, I began to feel that strange coldness again. This time, we didn't hear the whispers, but we saw something far worse. In the corner of the cemetery, by an old stone wall, we saw a figure, pale, hunched, and standing perfectly still. It was a man, but his features were indistinct, as though he was made of mist. He didn't move, but I could feel his eyes on us. We approached cautiously, the air thick with tension. But as we got closer, the figure disappeared into thin air. Just like that, vanished. We left immediately, our cameras capturing nothing but the empty cemetery. We never returned after that night, and I don't think anyone from Blackwood dares to visit after dark anymore. The cemetery still stands, waiting, and the whispers they still call out to those brave or foolish enough to venture near. The story of John Williams remains unsolved, but in Blackwood, it's said that if you listen closely, the whispers will tell you the truth about what happened, but only if you're willing to hear it.